Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So today is Monday, July the 9th. So this is the third, I think, Snapshots meeting. And the last meeting, we have reviewed the basic CSS snapshot proposal, the API design. And we have a design doc, PR out for review. And the link is here. I think so far we got Yang's comments, and probably because this snapshot design has been reviewed a couple of times, and there are not much issues around it. But the only thing I'm currently want to confirm with everyone is in the previous design, we always say snapshot, we take snapshot from a volume, and the volume represented by PVC. So we have consistent volume claim name in the volume snapshot spec to specify, okay, which volume you want to take snapshot from. And now, thinking about the future, we plan to support many different kinds of volume operations, including clone. And right now we propose, for example, to add source, like data source, into the PVC to specify, okay, what the data source come from. And thinking about snapshot, there's possibly we can also have a generic struct called snapshot source to specify, okay, where you want to, where this snapshot come from. So if it is a PVC name, then that means you want to take snapshot for that volume represented by this PVC. And if we want to support, let's say system admin want to directly take snapshot for their PV without PVC, user specified PVC, we can also have a PV name there. Or if we want to support clone, we can also have a snapshot name there, representing this as a clone operation. But it's still not finalized where we should have clone operation. For example, maybe it's possible we also want to put clone out function into the volume operation. Last time we discussed, we have let's say a generic volume operation API object, and the clone operation could be one of those. So it's not very clear right now whether, let's say, we should have a generic struct called a data source, or for snapshot have a snapshot source. So I want to hear some your comments, feedback around this. Anyone have some thoughts, whether we should just directly say
I have a question. So is the proposal basically added new struct to capture specifically what snapshots is going to look like? I think the original proposal was that it would be just a type and a name, 2 strings. And I missed the last meeting, so has that since changed into a first-class struct?
So for last time, we say, for example, for PVC, we want to support clone, then we can have a data source struct. And inside of data source struct, you can have different, let's say, the source could be from snapshot, then we have a snapshot source. Or it is for clone operation, the source would be another PVC name. Then we have let's say, persistent volume claim.
Kind of like the volume source structure that exists.
Oh, we use volume source but the name is taken. So
yeah. So the problem with that approach is that in order for anybody to extend this they will have to basically extend the Kubernetes API. And ideally, we want this mechanism to be extensible without modifying the Kubernetes API, right? We want to be able to add in new types of sources without having Kubernetes be aware of what those sources are. If you imagine the silly case that everybody wants, which is the GitHub repo source, ideally that GitHub repo volume source controller lives outside of Kubernetes, and Kubernetes is not aware that it's a type of volume source. If you have opaque way to represent the source, then we don't have to actually modify the Kubernetes API.
I see. So at that time, we also thought we have a type string and then name as a string. So that way we can solve the problem. So Kubernetes does not need to know what's
So Sauter, you're arguing that opacity is good in this case?
Yeah, and the reason for that is just based on everything that SIG architecture said when we went to them. They want more and more for the core of Kubernetes to be a very simple, minimalistic API, and everything should be an extension on top of that. So things like the ability to add in different types of volume sources should no longer be encoded into the core API. They should be just extensions on top of the core API.
Okay, but there has to be some place in which, if a bunch of drivers all want to, or if everyone wants to have the same kind of source, there needs to be a way to sort of set a standard that is true across implementations that maybe is outside of Kubernetes, but also isn't completely opaque. There has to be a middle ground where you can say, okay, everyone who wants to create volumes from snapshots, this is the way to do it. So we don't have people doing it different ways.
Yeah, the way I imagine it is something similar to the way that the provisioners currently work. The provisioner is an opaque string, more or less, and the external components that recognize or identify with that string basically take ownership of it. And then we have first-class provisioners that we provide. So, for example, a CSI provisioner, which we say, hey, if you specify a provisioner at kubernetes.io/CSI or whatever, we're going to take ownership of that. Somebody else can come along and create one that will also respond to the same string. Nothing prevents them from doing that, but the system is opaque and easily extensible.
Well, but there's a difference, which is that the consumers of that provisioner string in the storage class is just the administrator, the guy who set up Kubernetes, but the consumers of this volume source thing are going to be end users who are creating PVCs. There's a different class of user.
Well, okay, so I'm getting confused. I don't disagree that we should have a standard way, at least within the API, to say volume source and then have that be, could be snapshot, it could be an image, it could be a link directly to the source, it could be a registry location, it could be many things. And I think that was Jing's original question. But the other piece of it, aren't all mainly the variables going into the storage class today opaque? So are we proposing to change that? That's the piece I'm not understanding.
No, I think what's at question here is whether the volume source type should be opaque, or the type should be a first class, like an enum or something that's encoded into the API. I'm arguing that it should be opaque. I think, Ben, your argument was basically that the difference between a provisioner is that it's a cluster admin object, whereas this PVC is a user-facing object. And if that's the case, I'm not sure that actually makes a difference, right? So
Well, the reason I think it makes a difference is because different administrators are going to configure their instances of Kubernetes differently, and they're going to have to make choices that they understand. Mm-hmm. But one of the powers of having an API like the Kubernetes API is that consumers of it can write applications that just expect to run against a Kubernetes cluster, not knowing which one they're running against. You can write a standard, having a standardized API gives you a way to just consume the value of the API in an arbitrary way. And if one of the things we want people to be able to do is to create snapshots and then to consume the snapshots, there needs to be a standard that people can expect will always work.
Right.
And maybe that's outside of the Kubernetes core API, but there has to be a place where we can say, this is the standard, whether it's de facto or de jure.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I still don't think that enumerating that in the Kubernetes API is required, considering the great amount of pushback that we got on it. The way
I think I agree, but then you need something else. Just saying it's opaque is a cop-out that will ultimately cause more problems.
And what that something else can be is the Kubernetes conformance suite. So we can say in the conformance suite that if you are a conformant to some level of Kubernetes storage, then you must implement a snapshotter that will respond in this way to the Kubernetes API, basically.
Okay, that seems reasonable.
So I have a random thought. So to tackle both different types of volume sources in the PVC as well as conformance, why not have snapshot as a volume operation? So right now we're talking about doing cloning, modifying volumes, doing revert, restore everything through volume operation. Why can't we make snapshot itself a type of volume operation? And that way, a byproduct of volume operation snapshot is a PVC.
So and snapshot, I think the thing at question here is not snapshot, it's the create a new volume from a snapshot.
Sure, so let's say, if you have a volume operation that generates a snapshot, you can specify the destination, like in the destination, the PVC. And once the PVC is generated in the snapshot, you can just consume it. You don't have to worry about whether it's sourced from snapshot or sourced from PVC or sourced from something else. Like all that complexity is masked. So, for example, like if you go to the Jing's volume operation document, So if you scroll down, you see, for example, here, let's say if you have a new type of volume operation called snapshot, and the destination would be a PVC or something.
PVC, yeah, that's what I agree. The destination should be a PVC.
Oh, right, it would be a PVC, and users can just consume that. They don't have to worry about.
So you're suggesting?
Well, you also could, on top of that thought, which we were thinking with cloning, is having a storage class that creates snapshots from that image or creates clones from that image. So you still have the power of the administrator granting who can and can't snap something, the operation that should take place on something that is a snapshot object. But ultimately, the user just wants to use it. So they should be able to, from their normal flow, initiate from a PVC, request a snapshot, and it gets fulfilled without them having to have extensive knowledge of what they're asking for. They should just be able to utilize a storage class that does that for them, and then that provides the controls that the admin would want anyways. And that should be consistent across the board, somehow within the API to make sense for the user.
What I'm proposing to represent
right
snapshot
now, sorry, because a couple of things right now, we're making snapshot like a special operation that is separate from other volume operations. And this, I think, is a little awkward, especially because restore from snapshot is done through volume operation. So why should we make a special case for snapshot? So that's one thing.
I wanted to argue that restore from snapshot shouldn't exist and that you should only have create new volume from snapshot. But that's a separate argument.
Yeah, this restore, basically, like I mentioned last time, it involves two steps. One is create new volume from snapshot, and the second one is basically swap two sets of PVC pointers so that the restore here, I mean, is in place restore. That means you have existing PVC and you want to replace with volume, like provision from snapshot. So you need to second phase of swap the PVC to the new like PV. So if we support this like swap or replace, user can choose to do like in a different 2 steps. One is provision volume from snapshot and then swap the pointers between these 2 sets of PV.
So I think one argument for not putting everything into the volume operation object is whether volume operation is namespaced or non-namespaced. I believe as it's currently defined, volume operation is non-namespaced.
No, it's namespace. We
it is namespaced.
Two type. One type is for user initiate volume operation. That should be namespaced. So everything here is in one namespace.
So there's going to be 2 volume operation objects.
If we support non-namespace, then we have to have 2 kinds of volume.
Okay, so that makes sense.
Volume operation. I mentioned whether we should support like cross namespace, and there's another like discussion related to cross namespace operation, how it should. So go back to the original question, like whether we have if we want to add a struct called some source, data source for PVC, right? And we are saying, okay, we can have a type and have a string name. But the one problem is if we want to support later different kinds of sources, type and name might not enough. So let's say type for Git repo, type what we say type is Git repo, and the string, what's the string name? It might involve like multiple, let's say repository, like a link or location. So we cannot use a single, just a single string to represent the source.
You can always stuff whatever you want into a single string. You could encode it. This is the same problem that folks were talking about with the volume ID, having a single string versus a map. You can always encode a map into a string.
Up to the length limit, which is where you really have problems.
Right, and if the length is reasonable, it shouldn't be too much of an issue.
Then we kind of combine multiple information into a single string and then.
Right, and the point being that it's opaque, right? In general, it doesn't really make sense to have a map unless both the consumer and the sender are going to benefit from having it as separate pieces of information, right? If one party is basically just going to completely ignore the individual pieces and treat it as an aggregate, it doesn't really make sense to have distinct API fields for it. But that's we can argue about that. I'd like to go back to this argument about moving snapshots into volume operations. That's a really interesting idea. Does anybody have a counter argument for why that's not a good idea?
So I'm thinking that for volume operations, usually it is on the volume resource itself, and the result is still a volume resource.
Okay.
But in this case, we're actually creating a different resource with a snapshot.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair.
The intention for volume operation, I'm thinking, is for a little bit higher level operations. So it normally, let's say, involve steps and maybe even multiple objects. So we have a higher level controller to help user to like perform these little bit complicated operations. So and also show the status and whether this operation finish will succeed. And for the basic ones, we can have like lower level.
So the argument that I can buy is that the result of a snapshot operation will result in an object that other operations should be able to reference. And if it's just a volume operation object, that becomes very odd. Like if I create a snapshot how do I get a handle onto it? Like the reason that we did a snapshot as both a namespaced and non-namespaced object was so that user could have a handle on it, and the details of it could be hidden behind a non-namespaced object. So okay, I can buy that argument. I'm willing to put that to rest. Ardalan, do you agree?
To be honest, well, as far as Jing's argument, like in the case of restore from snapshot, the source and destination objects, they're different types. Like the source is a snapshot object, destination is a PVC. So there is precedence for having different types of.
That's different. Well, you restore, well, let's say you create a new volume from snapshot. It's actually like a post, or you create a new volume. That's different, right? So it's still on volume resource. That's different, I think.
Maybe we need to have the debate about whether we need a restore operation, or whether it can be removed and replaced with the combination of the create volume from snapshot and then the swap, because I think that's a much more straightforward way of doing a restore than having this funny. The first operation in the list, I think, could just be removed, and then everything else would be great.
So the purpose is to have where you're intentional about the source is to be able to keep the snapshot within your namespace. Is that accurate?
I'm sorry. Can you say that again?
So the idea of having them both. So is it the intention that users can create and restore snapshots without an admin assisting? Is that accurate? Is that the
yeah.
purpose? Okay.
Yes.
So having said that, then I think, and are we tied up on switching between a snapshot object to a PVC? We believe those should be the same type of objects. Is that sticky?
No. Could you scroll up in this document back to the number one, the restore case? So this is about taking a snapshot and restoring it to an existing PVC that is probably already bound to a pod. So I think we agree that we need a way to create new PVCs from snapshots.
I agree.
And we also need a way to take PVCs and take two PVCs and two PVs and sort of swap their ownership. That has uses outside of restoring snapshots.
Yes.
So if you have those two things, you don't need use case number one, because use case number one is just a combination of create me a new PVC from a snapshot and then swap it on an existing PVC.
Well, you could have a storage system that enables in-place restore, where it's actually more optimal than creating a new disk. Like it's not wasting extra resources or something like that.
That's covered in revert number 2.
Right. That's
number 2 is revert.
Yeah, revert is to take a snapshot that is associated with a PVC and just sort of time warping it backwards to an earlier time.
Okay.
So I believe that if you have number 2 and the swap and the create, you don't need number 1 at all. And number 1 really doesn't fit the mold of what's going on here, because it effectively modifies a PVC, and you end up getting another PVC, I think, out of it. When we talked about it, it creates this other PVC that you didn't want, and nothing should be creating PVCs on behalf of the user. PVCs are always something the user should create, saying this is what I want.
Right.
Yeah, and I think the PVC should drive the operation. So if the user asks for it from the PVC, a new one should be created in a volume operation. It should happen because of the request in the PVC, and that's always been our flow of how the flow follows. So I do agree with that. I think it's dangerous to have an existing PVC be populated with something else. We could have major data corruption, permissions. I mean, there could be lots of problems there.
Well, the specific problem is just that it creates a new PVC for you that you may or may not want. The way it's currently written, and it's not necessary.
Can we review these one by one? It sounds like there's some disagreement with them, and I think we're also all over the place. We're talking about this, and we're talking about 2 other things as well.
Yeah, because
well, I think the rest of the debate we were having depends on whether we think that this restore use case is something we need. And my argument is that we don't need it. We can get rid of it, and everything else will be fine. But then that affects the rest of the question about what is the mechanic for creating new volumes from snapshots.
Okay, so can we go through this list one by one from number one and see if there's a justification for having each one or not?
Yes, sure. But first, the volume operation here I propose is namespace. So I didn't put, let's say, namespace information. It just means it is in the, everything is just in the same namespace. And the first one is coming from the in-place restore, like we proposed in the SIG storage before. The purpose is if user already have a PVC reference by a pod, so the user just want to, let's say, restore that volume back to the snapshot.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a restore, this called in-place restore operation. And so the PVC one is existing PVC currently used by some pod. And the source would be a snapshot user take at a certain point of time.
Mm-hmm.
Then this operation will first create a new volume from the snapshot 1, 0, 1.
Mm-hmm.
And then the controller will also have a new PVC, like called PVC prime, PV prime to represent this new volume. And in the second, the operation then go ahead to swap the existing PVC1 to point to the new volume represented by PV prime. And the old volume will be now referenced by, let's say, PVC prime. So now user have two sets of PVCs. For PVC1, it will point to the new volume provision from snapshot. And then the PVC prime will point to the old volume. And user can decide what to do with this old volume. They can delete or just keep it. And the user can also have a handle of that volume.
But both of those other steps you mentioned, we agreed need to exist independently as well.
Yeah.
So this is really just a combination of two other operations that we also want to exist.
Yes, I understand your point.
And the thing that makes me most uncomfortable is the new PVC that gets created that you didn't necessarily want. You know, PVC should only be created by the user, not by the controller.
Yeah, the controller right now here probably just have some way of, let's say, name the PVC as PVC1 dash like old or something. Yeah. So that's true. So if for user, like if they do this two-step like by themselves, they probably have more visibility of what's going on. So basically this operation,
I mean, who's to say that this, like, you don't have to force the two-step behavior on the end user, right? You could still have essentially a macro or something that wraps the two methods into one. Question is, what would that look like?
You'd have a storage class that actually executes the volume operation, and the user would still ask for it from a PVC. And then it would create the PVC, the PV, do the snapshot, return it back to the user.
For an in-place restore?
For an in-place restore? Yeah, maybe not.
Yeah, I think the in-place restore triggering that is the question. Like, what if we have two separate volume operation objects? Ideally, like Jing is right, you don't want to have the user manually do that. They should just be able to say, I want to swap this out. How do you trigger that operation?
Wait, you mean the swap operation? We have a...
Oh, no. I agree the swap operation makes sense. I'm saying that the higher level operation, number one, restore from snapshot, and restore operation, how do you do that?
The in-place restore, you mean another restore, you mean the just provision new volume from snapshot? So here, the current create new volume from snapshots in the existing snapshot API design is we have a snapshot source information in the PVC, and then the CSI, like the external provisioner, will recognize this snapshot and provision the volume from the snapshot. And I kind of have a question saying, okay, since now we have different operations and clone or something, whether we should make it a general source. That's the question. Yeah, before it's just very simple. In the PVC, we add a new field called snapshot, let's say, source.
Well, I don't think we have to agree on the specifics of that. We just have to agree that there is a way to define a PVC that causes a volume to get created from a snapshot. And if that is true, then you don't need number one as an operation, because you can combine whatever that is with the swap and you're done.
Yeah.
And then if we can agree on that, then we can go back to arguing about what that is and exactly how you create that PVC from a snapshot.
And the problem, I think, is that swap, yeah, we have that basic primitive volume operation. Creating a new volume is not a volume operation, right? Creating a new volume requires you to create a PVC object.
Yeah, so it's better to have, let's say, PVC YAML file, everything information. Otherwise, if we put it as a volume operation, it's hard to insert that's how you want to create this new volume. So
basically, the use case is that if you want to do an in-place swap, you should not be forced to create a new PVC object and then throw away that object and then swap it. That's just unnecessary steps and creation of a user visible object that's not necessary.
So you're arguing that we need to keep number one, but change the semantics so that PVC prime never exists?
Correct.
The good thing about PVC prime is how you deal with the old volume. You don't want to lose the control of your old volume. But
maybe you do. I mean, maybe the answer is if you want to keep it, then you do a combination of create volume from snapshot and swap, and then you get to keep it. But if you don't want to keep it, then you use this volume operation that just throws away the old PV.
Yeah, I could buy that.
So
what if you redefine restore from snapshot to be we are creating a new PVC with a new PV, just like creating a PVC restores from snapshot. So that will replace that operation. And so in this, basically in the case of restore from a snapshot, we're creating a new PVC and a new PV. There is no binding, unbinding business here. We don't have to worry about that.
Restore from snapshot is about an existing PVC that is already bound to something, so you don't want to delete it.
So restore basically involves creating a new PVC PV pair based on the snapshot data. And you don't have to worry about binding, unbinding. Basically, PVC
we already have that case, right? So if on the whole volume source that we're talking about on the PVC.
Right. So I'm saying, yeah, like that whole separate mechanism for doing that, we can just rely on volume operation for everything, for snapshot, for
Ardalan is arguing that we don't need the PVC create from snapshot, that we can just use a volume operation to do it. I don't know if I agree with that.
I don't like that. The reason I don't like that is because now you have two different ways to be able to provision volumes in the Kubernetes API. Ideally, there's only one consistent way to create a volume, and that is by creating a PVC object. If now we're saying, hey, you're going to create this volume operation thing, and that automatically is going to create a new PVC object on your behalf, that's ugly. That's weird.
It's a different workflow for sure, but all the talk we had about, how to have a generic volume source, to support different types of volume sources, all that discussion kind of goes away if we do it this way, because here we can...
It goes away for snapshots, but for every other way to create a volume from something else, it doesn't go away. Unless you add new volume operations for every one of those
Right, we're just
things.
moving the problem from one place to another.
But at least it's a place where, so these volume operations are going to be CRDs or, types. So everything moves here and it's consistent. People don't have to worry about, doing different workflows, some things through API objects, some things through volume operation. Everything happens through volume operations.
It feels like you're moving more to more of an imperative model rather than a declarative model if you do that.
There's nothing imperative or declarative about doing it one way or another. It's just the same.
I think the biggest problem I have with it is just like how it shifts the action that the user is taking for provisioning a volume like one step back. So instead of actually creating a PVC object, they're creating something else, and that implicitly creates a PVC on their behalf. And then now that PVC object doesn't necessarily have a strict like mark saying that the source of this was something. I guess you could add an annotation on it, but
yeah, you can always do that.
Workflow just seems weird, maybe because it's new.
Also, because when you provision volume from Snapshot, you still need to specify all the information related to PVC, right?
But when you think about it itself, like if we want to support, for example, cloning across namespaces or things like that, somebody has to create a PVC somewhere else. So like the controller has to clone it across namespaces, create a new PVC in a different namespace. So what I'm proposing is not so much different from that.
Then if you use volume operation, how you specify the spec of the PVC? The spec can include, let's say, the mode or some parameters, a storage class, etc. Where those
right, the spec wouldn't be any different than how we're taking Snapshot today, like in the current PR proposal. So it wouldn't be any different. It's just that instead of doing it through a Snapshot object, you do it through a volume operation object.
Well, in the volume operations, you just specify operation name and the source and destination, right? You don't
those are just
specify any other details. Yeah, so those doesn't have other details, right?
Okay, so your source would be your PVC, your destination would be your Snapshot object.
Then you still have a PVC existing,
right?
Somehow.
Yeah, I think the question is, how do you set all the other fields of the PVC if you create PVCs that way? Like, well, what if I want to change the size, or what if I want to change the storage class?
Well, and the other question is, what if does the user always have visibility to the source? Like, could that source exist outside their namespace and they can't even see it? And how do we expect them to be able to find that?
Well, that's a problem with the current proposal too.
But I think Ben's argument is actually a really interesting one. Ben, do you want to reiterate that?
Yeah, the issue is not the source, it's the destination. With the PVC, you get to specify all kinds of fields in the spec, including the size, the storage class, and who knows what might be added in the future.
So basically,
you need ways
if you move the provisioning logic into a separate object, now you're going to have to duplicate all the things that we already built for PVC into this new object, right? So if you have a new way to be able to create a volume, except this time with a special type of source, you also need to be able to specify things like, what is my storage class going to be? Essentially, you're recreating the PVC object. So every time you change the PVC object to have some new field on it, we're going to have to modify this new object as well. That seems like a really bad design to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
I like the statement that the only way you ever create a volume is by creating a PVC.
Me too.
It's consistent.
I mean, I like that too, but I'm saying, like, in the future, if you're going to support, let's say, migrating a volume across namespaces or something to that effect.
Yeah, I think what it might
be create a PVC in a new namespace, so you're actually effectively creating namespace PVC.
I feel like volume operation might be like a crutch for us. It's like we're trying to find a place to fit these things, and we're just throwing them there because it seems easy. And maybe we should look at these cases more closely and see if there's a better home for them. So like for provisioning a volume, there's a very natural home in the PVC object. For creating a snapshot, the new snapshot data objects that are proposed, I think they look very clean, they look nice, they're usable, it makes sense. For these other operations, maybe it should be that volume operation is a last resort thing that if we have absolutely nowhere else to put it, we're going to put you there, instead of the let's put everything into volume operation?
Yes. So I have the question of what kind of volume operation we should include. Should support. Well,
when we went through the list last week, I think
Mhm.
everyone after number 1 made sense to me.
Okay. Yeah. So because number 1
can we go through the other ones real quick then, after number 1?
Okay. Number 2 is if volume like plugin support this, that means you have existing volume and you want to revert your volume back to the snapshot you've taken. So
what's the difference between this and the first one?
First one is you create a new volume. This one is still the exactly the same disk. You just revert back to.
I see what Ben is saying about number 1 then.
Yeah.
Okay.
So for this one, not all the volume plugin, let's say GC doesn't support right now.
Yep.
So but some other volume plugin might support this revert operation.
I see. Okay. And then number 3 is replace volume, which is just a swap.
Swap
Okay.
the point.
Got
You
it.
have 2 sets of PVCs.
Yeah.
So the reason it's good fit here is I'm thinking because it involves multiple objects. So it's not a single PVC. So it's hard to like specify just inside of one PVC. Let's say you have 2 sets of PVC and you want to swap them.
Okay.
And the fourth one is something like some volume plugins can support dynamically modify your volume. Let's say the size, the type, and
this one I think is one of those things where we already have a home for it, right? Volume resizing.
Resize is in PVC, right? You can
Right.
resize. You just change the volume, the size in your spec.
Yes.
But if we want to change the type, let's say, then we need to add another. We need to just, I don't know.
You could just change the type, right? First of all, changing the type is a very strange thing, right? Like going from block to file is probably not going to happen. That doesn't really make sense.
Some plugin is like what I see is like say AWS can support change some of their volume type.
So I think what you mean by volume type is like performance characteristics.
Yeah. Yes.
So the performance characteristic thing I can absolutely believe. And I think that's something we should consider is like, for example, how do I change my storage class after it is provisioned? If a storage system allows you to automatically upgrade your IO speeds after a volume is created, should I have to basically snapshot and create a new volume, or can I do it in place? I think so. The ability to change the storage class of an existing PVC is an interesting and viable use case to me, but
how does that actually work on the physical storage? Like, can I actually do that with real storage? I can just
for like cloud storage where it's virtualized. Basically, the difference between an SSD and a spinning disk is all imaginary. So it would just be, oh yeah, for sure. You flip a bit, now you have SSD like speeds instead of slow speed.
Yeah, it's usually a QoS policy, which is just a number that gets modified.
But that's going to depend on the type of storage, right? Then it comes down to what you provisioned to begin with. It's not like I can
so that's
switch from Ceph to Gluster or something by modifying the storage class to suddenly have different.
Exactly. So it's not like volume type. It's basically storage class. It's saying I want a different storage class.
But you can only modify a subset of the storage class because we agree that certain types of modifications make no sense.
So storage class with the same provisioner. And even then, there might be things that don't
long list of caveats.
Yeah.
So this might trigger migration. It depends on what change that is. Could trigger migration.
Sure, we don't have to design that here. The point is that I think there are better ways to handle both resizing, which we already have that API in the PVC for the storage class thing, maybe actually changing the storage class on the PVC should trigger it instead of a volume operation.
Yeah, the benefit of this is the user have some visibility, better visibility, see whether it succeed or failed. They can like monitor this. It's more like a job, so they can easier to monitor.
Yeah, but then now will end up with like competing APIs, right? So if we resizing one to beta, and if we're going to say there's two different
one of the objections,
resizing.
Yeah, one of the objections you guys had about restore from snapshot through volume operation was that you're replicating a bunch of fields in the PVC, like volume size, storage class, and we're doing exactly just that here.
Yeah, exactly. Like volume operation.
Yeah, but the question of how do you monitor the status is a really interesting one, because if you just change the size field in the PVC and expect a resize to occur, then how do you represent the case where their volume is perfectly healthy but it can't be resized?
So I think Hemant took a look at that and he added in a bunch of states, I believe, into the PVC to represent that. It's not.
But you're going to get a combinatorial number of states as you add different ways to muck with the PVC and different things that can go wrong.
Yeah, that is true. But the alternative is pretty ugly too, which is you essentially have two different places where you can represent the same set of operations. So like duplicating the entire PVC into a volume operation object seems like a poor idea too. Ideally, what we want is to be able to use the original object, but also be able to represent the status of the operation.
Yes.
So we can think this as a like higher level operation. So the lower level, let's say, it still goes through the PVC change, but this higher level give you more, let's say, observability. So we might add something like the lower level cannot.
But if the lower level doesn't really give you observability, then it's harder to build on the higher level. I think my gut feeling is I don't like duplicating objects. It's like duplicating code. You're going to end up with skew and different, like, oh, why does this exist here, but it doesn't exist here kind of thing. So we should avoid that. So wherever we feel like the volume operation is duplicating an existing operation, that's a no-no. Let's not do that.
Okay.
Only put operations in volume operation that we have absolutely no way of putting somewhere else.
Okay. Yeah, so I have the thoughts related to clone too. Here I put clone when I propose this, but right now clone I'm not sure. So if we say PVC has a source,
right,
and then that can trigger clone, more like a clone, right? So you can volume, you can clone snapshots. So that's why I'm thinking, okay, if we want to support the same way, either you clone volume or clone snapshots, then PVC will have a source, snapshot will have a source.
Yep.
So right now, snapshot has a single field called PVC name. If you want to support clone the same way as clone PVC, like we can't propose to change.
There's not really a use case for cloning snapshots, though. I mean, cloning volumes, yes.
There's a use case for migrating snapshots. I wonder if that's valuable.
Clone snapshot, when I think about it, is more like a copy snapshot from one zone to another zone.
Migrate.
Yeah, so if migrate means the old one will be still exist.
I think you would want to maybe possibly clone a snapshot. Why would you think you'd never want to do that?
Because they're read-only and they're unchangeable. So I mean, having two of them doesn't really
I think
much.
it's copying
Well, I mean,
across availability zones.
create a clone from a snapshot. So,
Oh,
right, that's what I was thinking, not actually clone it, but I want to, like, I have a snapshot object and I want to maintain that, and I want to create several copies of it in different namespaces for different users.
yeah, but
So this
that's
is
a
like-
migration use case again. That's not a.
This
I mean,
is like the snapshot uploaded in a object store somewhere, something like that. So it's not the same snapshot that we are thinking still on the original storage anymore.
But the user doesn't know where the snapshot is. They did all to them. It's just a handle that represents something
Right.
that they can make volumes from, and having two of them doesn't do you any good because you'll get the same result regardless of which one you use.
Yeah, here maybe clone is not a good name. What I think is more like maybe it's called migration or something. But basically, you have a different location.
A different availability zone that you want to make it available in.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. That kind of stuff makes sense.
So I think what I'm beginning to realize is that volume operation is a very convenient catch-all. We'll throw everything in there because we don't have to think twice. But when we start doing that, then we might end up with a worse API because we end up with duplication of things, ways to trigger behavior. So
But don't underestimate the value of having like
Status.
an object that has the status of that operation.
I agree. I think the takeaway for today should be to think about how we can better represent status in the existing objects rather than create a new object that does the same thing except with a status.
Or maybe you really do need a separate object for the status, but it could just be a generic status operation or volume operation status thing.
It's really hard to have two different objects that coordinate for the same operation. It gets
I'm imagining like for the resize, maybe the way you do trigger a resize is you modify the spec of the PVC, but then somehow out of that comes a status object where you can see what the status of that resize operation is, so that if it fails and then you want to come back tomorrow and try it again, maybe you get a different status object that you can look at.
Right.
I don't know what that would look like, but the only other alternative I can see is you have a long list of fields on the PVC that shows status of everything you could possibly have tried to do.
Right. That's an interesting thought. Essentially, it's like events, but more
Structured.
Yeah.
Yeah, with a handle where you know what you did that caused that event.
Right. That's a neat idea. All right, what time is it? We have 5 minutes. So, Jing, what was the main takeaway that you wanted to, or you were hoping to close on for this meeting?
Because right now, volume snapshot is still in early design, so we still have time to. But the main thing I want to close is snapshot. Whether we have a PVC name, just a single PVC name as a single field, to, let's say, take snapshot from this volume, or we have a source, snapshot source. So it could extend to other things.
I mean, we definitely want to make the volume source something that's opaque. Or sorry, no, let me take that back. We definitely want to have a volume source that will allow supporting of more than one type of volume plugin, or volume source. So things like we want to support both snapshots as well as something arbitrary like a Git repo. The debate is about how we're going to expose that, whether it should be an opaque field or a first-class field. There's arguments in both directions. I don't think that should be a blocker for you yet. I think you can break your project down into 3 steps. The first step is the snapshot and snapshot data API.
The question I have is directly in the snapshot spec. Snapshot spec right now we have a PVC name.
Oh, okay.
Jing, do you want to share the spec? So
What?
Yeah.
The snapshot.
I don't think it's debatable whether the snapshot comes from PVC, but the PVC can come from a snapshot or from other things. So it's the other direction.
I think it's Jing was thinking about replacing the volume snap the the PVC source to a data source or something. So it's I think we are talking about multiple things, so getting a little confused.
Can you see my screen? Oh, hi.
Who's currently sharing?
Jing's sharing.
Oh, okay.
Oh, sorry. Is this? So in current volume snapshots spec, you'll see this single field called persistent volume claim name. That specifies where you take your snapshot from.
Okay, got it.
So this is the field I'm like.
This is uncontroversial.
What is the alternative proposal?
Have a snapshot source struct, and then you can have different type of source for the snapshot. So Ben,
what would you imagine would that look like? I guess you would have a snapshot that was created from like a GitHub repo. Yeah, I don't think that makes sense. I think snapshot very specifically is for PVC objects, so I think it's fine leaving it as just the PVC name.
What I'm thinking is, yeah, it's more like think about maybe it's not clone or it's called copy or migrate. So you have a another snapshot as a source, or
I see.
You have a PV as a source.
Yeah, I like the migration scenario. The way that it makes sense in my head is that you just create a new snapshot object in that cluster, and that's it. And if it's within the same cluster, then it should have different names. The source here is not another snapshot; it's still a particular PVC. I guess you could have it's as long as it's optional, right? Like you could have a snapshot that exists that didn't come from a PVC. What is the PVC name? This is just an informative thing, right? It's not going to dictate any sort of behavior.
The PVC name is just the in your namespace what PVC available, right? You can put a PVC name.
Yeah, this tells the controller what to take a snapshot of. It's essential.
Yeah. So
this is on the this is on the volume snapshot request object.
Whether we should support just use PV name, for example. So if our system admin, they don't have PVC, right? They just have PV, they prepare some PV, and they want to take snapshot. Then that means they need to create a PVC, first create PVC and take snapshot.
Yeah, I think the what we need to focus on is what is the verb here. The verb here is volume snapshot. It's not snapshot of a snapshot. So having the source here just be a persistent volume claim name makes perfect sense. Having the source here be something more opaque or arbitrary, where it could be another snapshot, does not make sense to me. I support leaving it like this.
Okay.
Well, you could imagine cases of like importing snapshots from outside the system.
Sure, yeah, but I don't think this would be the right API for that. Like,
well, no, I mean, what I was going to say is in that case, you could just leave this field blank because the snapshot already exists. The only reason this field is here is to tell the controller what to do. But if the snapshot already exists, it doesn't matter what you put there. You could.
Well, that's where I got confused too in the beginning. But we have two different volume snapshot objects, right? This is the request object. The request saying, please create a snapshot. Once the snapshot's created, there's going to be a volume snapshot data object. So this is on the request. On the request, you always have to specify what you actually want to create a snapshot of.
But if the admin wanted to pull in some pre-existing snapshot so that the user could use it, he would have to create one of these.
They create
So that the user could see it, because the user can't see the volume snapshot data. The user can only see this.
Right.
So he would create one of these with a blank PVC name and some data, and then the user could do what they wanted with that.
Right. Yep.
Well, how do you map that to the snapshot on the storage backend? How would you know?
Well, however the admin, there'd be some way to do it.
It's just like
through
an
admin
PV
API
object. Like if you have a PV that already exists, you create a PV with a partial pointer back to a PVC, and then you create a PVC to complete that. So similar, you have snapshot and snapshot data. So you create a snapshot data for a pre-provisioned snapshot, and then you create a snapshot object that points to that snapshot data object. Bye.
Okay, so if no other objection, we just keep persistent volume claim name here.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. Leave it as an optional field. Yep, that makes sense.
Okay, and we can support static binding. So admin can just create a snapshot data object and bind to some users volume snapshot object.
Yep.
Okay. So that's the main actually question I want to close.
Awesome.
So we can go ahead with snapshot part. So Xing and I should be able to, let's say, send out PR, the code for controller, and probably, let's say, we're testing GC. When it's available, user can like review it, and so we also need volunteer to help with other, let's say, volume plugin support. So,
hey, Jing, I do have one question about the data source. Have we decided on that? I thought there was just some questions about the data source part.
yeah, it's not decided yet.
Okay.
So
we'll leave that one. Okay, that's the second.
That one to the next meeting. We finalize the data source for PVC in the next meeting.
Right. I'm also not sure whether we can add that to the, under API storage, whether we can still add an object there or not. That I'm not quite sure if we're allowed to add any new object there.
Okay. So for this week, we are more focused on snapshot itself, and next week we can like talk about the PVC source, the data source, and finalize that design.
Okay.
And can move on to support restore provision volume from snapshot. Yeah. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.